Hello, Claudia. I'm
Hey, Stephen.
so glad to be here with you. Um, you and I attended the same college. We studied with and were inspired by many of the same professors. So I think they would be beaming like proud parents to see their two students in conversation at Senior Arts and Lectures. So thanks for joining us tonight. Speaking of conversation, I'm excited to talk to you about your new work, Just Us, An American Conversation. And I thought maybe we could start with that title, right? The last book was called Citizen, An American Lyric. Your two previous books were subtitled An American Lyric, but this one is subtitled An American Conversation. The lyric in Citizen was very polyvocal, right? Sometimes it's you, sometimes it's your informants, sometimes it's the person reading. Conversation feels a little bit more claustrophobic, a little bit more constraining and less lyrically open. Could you talk about that, the shift from lyric to conversation, and how that, and just also kind of, are you always the I in the conversation in this book?
In this book, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Well, one of the things I gave up in Citizen was interiority, that I could mine, that I could pull apart. And the only way for me to get that is to be the I. Mm-hmm. And so I made the decision to be the person who was in conversation with others so that I could be accountable to every single second and be able to put the language under a sort of microscope. So it's claustrophobic in that sense, that it is about language and the strategy of language. Mm-hmm. What is it doing? Why does it make you feel in the way that it makes you feel? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so the essay seemed more of a form, a genre to hold that than the lyric, which is about the unsaid. And this is about saying everything.
Yes, overcoming the unsaid or overcoming the silence. Yeah.
Exactly.
You, at one point in the book, you write, to converse is to risk the unraveling of the said and the unsaid. To converse is to risk the performance of what's held by the silence. So it's all about the performance and the staging of like the kind of undoing or unraveling of the said and the unsaid. I wonder if you could, just to get us started, read a bit from the book so that our listeners have a sense of this essay style. If you could maybe read from the chapter Social Contract, and then we can sort of talk about
whatever we want to talk about.
Whatever we want to talk about, what we think is going on in this anecdote.
I'm at a dinner where the whys and wherefores of the 2016 presidential election come up, because they do. And one guest, it turns out, is writing a book. In the description of the book, the role of racism is barely mentioned. Hold up. It's my belief anti-Black and anti-Latinx racism, couched in the terms Obamacare and immigration and the wall, was the mighty engine that brought our current president to power, the very president who refers to himself as a nationalist. The generic and deracialized many factors are the rhetorical tide I swim upstream against, as if George Wallace hadn't attributed his political success to the articulation of racist rhetoric. Despite his declared neutral feelings about Black people, Wallace ran on segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and promised to protect the Anglo-Saxon Southland. What exactly has changed? There is no way to predict that white Democrats who had voted for President Obama would vote in key states for a fascist regime, is the persistent retort. Our resident expert added that he didn't have a crystal ball, as if unarmed dead Black people weren't lying in our American streets, or white people weren't calling the police on Black people without cause, with full knowledge of all the ways that could go wrong and end in the loss of a life. And as if our 45th president, before his official run, hadn't been vocal about the lie voters had been hadn't been vocal about the lie that voters had been duped by a president who wasn't born in America. My dogged insistence meant I was sailing closer and closer to the trope of the angry Black woman. I wasn't completely right. There were the Russians, the Electoral College, and misogyny. But I needed the people to understand I would rather be wrong, would gladly join them in the perception of an unpredictable world if I could, perhaps. I learned early that being right pales next to staying in the room. All kinds of things happen as the night unfolds. But sometimes I become caught by the idea that repetition occurs if the wheel keeps spinning. Repetition is insistence, and one can collude only so much. Sometimes I just want to throw myself inside the gears. Sometimes, as James Baldwin said, I want to change one word or a single sentence. It's harder than you would think, because white people don't really want change if it means they need to think differently than they do about who they are. We have a precedent in Urcha Kitt, who, after confronting Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson about Vietnam at a luncheon in the White House, was blacklisted. Democrats all. Whiteness wants the kind of progress that reflects what it values, a reflection of itself. Voter suppression is about racism. Immigration issues and DACA are informed by racism. I am saying this and I am saying that, and as if I had suddenly become too much, a metaphorical white hand reaches out to pull me back from the fold, from the perilous edge of angry Black womanhood. A white woman effectively ends the conversation on 45's campaign tactic by turning her gaze towards the dessert tray. How beautiful, she says. Homemade brownies on a silver tray. Hers is the fey gesture I have seen exhibited so often by white women in old movies, women who are overcome by shiny objects. It's so blatant a redirect, I can't help but ask aloud, and the most obvious question, am I being silenced? I'm aware my question breaks the rules of social engagement. I'm aware I will never be invited back to this house, back into the circle of these white people. I understand inadvertently causing someone to feel shame isn't cool, but am I being silenced? I wanted the white woman to look me in the eye and say, yes, yes, you are. I wanted her to own her action and not cower. I would have liked her then. Instead, all of us around the table have to watch her sink into her seat as she looked down at her hands as if I'd refused to shake them. Now the others have to take side. White solidarity needs to be reestablished. It's then I understand I forfeited the game the minute I stepped into a house where I am the only Black person. The woman and I could have started conversing instead of one of us using language to erase the next moment. Doesn't she see that even as a white woman, she remains subject to the arbitrary power of our executive branch? Shouldn't we get clear on how we got here? Or are our alliances set? Does she see my insistence as its own form of erasure? Or is white civility simply being put to work to maintain the fiction of white benevolence and the uncouthness of Blackness? And then I'll read the final.
Mhm.
Had the woman who admired the dessert tray in an attempt to redirect the conversation said to me, here's your coat, what's your hurry? Now that would have made me smile. The corners of my mouth would have lifted and raised my cheeks to form crow's feet around my eyes. I would have smiled with my eyes in admiration of her directness. Get out, rather than serving up redirection and false civility.
Thank you. I really love that chapter because it's both it's both a kind of statement of like the almost the thesis of conversation in the book, of like conversation is, like you sort of say elsewhere, creating a disturbance in the flow of the ordinary, right? But it's also about a failure, right? Like the sort of it's like a conversation that can't happen, right? At one point late in the book, you quote Lauren Berlant on like thinking as interrupting the flow of consciousness. She writes, "To be forced into thought is to begin to formulate the event of feeling historical in the present." And like in this chapter, I kept thinking about that old phrase from the 70s of consciousness raising, right? Conversation as consciousness raising versus conversation in that sense that Berlant gives us of just making people feel historical, embedded in the present. And so I wanted you to sort of talk about those aims of conversation in this book, feeling historical versus something you seem to kind of want in the chapter, which is the raising of the consciousness of the other guests. In other words, is there any difference between
between the two?
Yeah, between the two, making them feel like they are in a historical moment that is not, it's not an accident that like this happened. Yeah. Which you accomplish, right? But at the same time, there's a feeling on your part of a failure that like consciousness wasn't raised in that exchange.
Right. I mean, I think the way I think about these moments is that we're together and we know something is wrong. And you're like, I know this is wrong. I know this is wrong. How is it wrong? And so can we have a curiosity around the history and the reality that made the thing look the way that it does, or make the thing act the way that it does? And so in that sense, you are asking your interlocutor to take on reality in the way that we both can see it. And then from there, we can maybe reposition ourselves relative to those facts. You know, you can say, yes, he said X or Y thing, but that stuff doesn't really affect my life, so I don't care. I mean, I know people can't talk like that, can't speak like that, but in a way, I think it would help us if we began to speak to the reality we're living. This kind of insistence of interpreting the text that we're given as if it's not our reality allows some people comfort and other people feel gaslighted. You know, you're like, no, he said he was a white nationalist. And you're saying, no, it's about economics. I'm like, yeah, but they're Black dead people in the street. So the economics of that is what?
What exactly?
White supremacy or something else that I'm missing.
I see. That's the feeling historicals. Like, yeah, that's the thing that's kind of at risk in the era of social media. It's just like the shared truth.
Exactly.
Of reality. Yeah. I see.
And in a way, the book is an attempt to push back at the mechanisms of this administration's assertion that everything's fake news. There's no science. There's no facts. It's just, you know, today I say this, tomorrow I didn't say that. Today, you know, one reality exists, tomorrow another. And you're like, no. Actually, some things, climate change might, you know, that stays the same. In fact, it gets worse tomorrow. So it was a conscious attempt to sort of try and reinsert the facts back into the jostling of trying to get to know another person.
So maybe this is a good time to then talk about the form of the book, right? That is to say, I was sort of thinking, the way the book is structured, your essayistic prose and the anecdotes are on the recto, and then sort of the sources and the fact checks are on the verso. And you just sort of answered the question, but it's like, is the fact check how we have to write poetry in the age of Trump, right? Like that's a startling thing about the book, is like the voluminous equal weight sort of given to the sources of your knowledge.
And some of the sources are images, some of them
Mm-hmm.
are tweets, some of them are, so it's not, the fact-checking page is actually a place sometimes for facts, sometimes for associations, sometimes for reciprocity between the text and some historical image. So it's a fluid space.
It's fluid space, yeah.
I wanted it to be a fluid space because I wanted the text to allow for wonder and drifting and a kind of interior examination of what is known and what is not known, what is trusted and what is not trusted, all of that to happen, so that the book is not about the communication of something,
Mm-hmm.
but the process of something.
I see.
So that reading is a process and not so that the text is an open text. It's asking you not to, it's much in this book, you probably knew when you read it. You probably were like, yeah, I know that. But the question is, with what is known, where does that take you? If you then see Miles Davis at the police station after the policeman has beaten him up because he's standing outside having a cigarette after a concert. Like, how does the text and that image kind of metabolize and readjust themselves and then create what you were referring to, a kind of historicizing of the present moment.
The present moment. Yeah. That that sense of, you call it at one point, the sort of loop that hooks the past, the present, and in sort of Black life. I was really excited. I was excited to receive your book, and as I waited for the arrival of the book, I had sort of imagined a Rankine poem that was titled Memorial Day 2020. It's like I was thinking, oh, okay, there's going to be something in here about, like, George Floyd and Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, right? Like that Memorial Day 2020. And then it's not here. That's the temporality of writing books, right? But you do talk about the sort of debates that go on in your own household. And in my household, there was a debate about why I was sort of obsessing and doom scrolling around Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper to a far greater extent than I was engaging the question of George Floyd. And I imagine that, like, you might have done the same, if only because, like, Christian Cooper survived that encounter. So it's like narratable at the level of, like, the anecdote. And in your work, it's like, Black death, Blackness as a kind of vulnerability to death, premature death. It hovers around the encounters, right? That the ones that you're narrating.
Well, I have said that if Amy Cooper had arrived in my life before I handed in the book a year ago, you're right, she would be in this book but not because of the conversation she had with Christian Cooper. She would be in the book because of the conversations I had about her after their encounter.
And what were those like?
the thing that struck me were people, two things happened. I had friends who called up and said, Amy Cooper is racist, but should she have lost her job? Isn't that taking it a little far?
Mm.
Isn't that just a little too much? Mm-hmm. And this, as you know, Stephen, happened in the 24-hour cycle of Floyd losing his life. His life. So people didn't really need to use their imagination in terms of what the intent was in calling in the police falsely. And yet the refusal to go there, the refusal to understand how normative her calling in the power.
Her weaponization of language.
Exactly. So that was one thing. And what was the other thing that was said to me that I found? There was another statement about, this had more to do with Christian Cooper. I was sort of disappointed in his refusal to bring charges against her. Because to me, that meant that he thought about it. I mean, he was obviously able to take care of himself in that moment. And he survived that moment. But so many people don't. And it was a moment where he could have made the irresponsible use of weaponizing people's fantasies as something that they need to be accountable to. And I know it's also, doesn't sort of flow in with the issues around calling the police when it's not necessary. But I definitely felt some disappointment about that. As to the video itself, though, I found that to be one of the most fascinating documents that we have been given as American citizens. And for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the things, I don't know if you remember this, but before she makes the phone call, do you remember what she does?
Well, I have a very vivid memory of her like almost strangling the dog.
Yeah, there's that. But
no, I don't. Please share. Well, remind me. I don't remember.
She says, "Excuse me." And that to me is really a fascinating, talk about civility, talk about social contracts. She said, "Excuse me." And then she made the phone call. She literally turned to him and said, "Excuse me." And then she does another thing, which is she calls him an African American. So the ways in which she is exhibiting her own wokeness and her own liberalness, as she is also weaponizing this created threat because she feels indignant to be asked to do something she doesn't want to do.
That's right. Yeah.
So that the way that video to me is really it's really an important document, I think.
Yeah, it's an important document of white privilege, right?
Yeah.
Just like you say, like how these almost, you want to say, antithetical impulses reinforce her wokeness and her I don't even know what to call it. It's her racism.
Racism.
Yeah, I'm just like, I was gonna euphemize and move it in the direction of the fragile white and it's like, no, I don't. It's
racism.
Racism. I would have asked you this question if we were talking about Don't Let Me Be Lonely, but I'm asking it because it appears in this book as well. Planes. Could we talk about planes? Like,
sure.
What is it about planes that makes them such delicious sites for field work? Like what there's like these, it's like a lab, you know,
it is like a lab.
It's like a lab.
Well, I think the liminal space of airports where you're neither here nor there. You and also I think there's a kind of exhaustion we often have. Either we've gotten to the airport very early and we're exhausted that way, or we've been traveling and we're exhausted. So and there's no accountability. You know, if you're traveling on your own, nobody's gonna say, hey, Claudia, don't do that. That's not cool. You know, nobody, unless they're a stranger. Yeah. And so people, I think, lose some of that social contract behavior. And also you are put in proximity with other people for long periods of time.
Yes, right, and you can't escape.
And you can't escape. You know, you could be sitting in the waiting area for hours if there's a delayed plane. And then it becomes a communal moment. What did they say? Did you hear? You know, and those little comments often lead into other kinds of conversations, depending on who you're sitting with and your own openness to the conversation.
I would even add, you describe it as a liminal space, and I agree. It's like in the book, it's like the hallway, right? In that dinner party, but it's as a liminal space. I imagine it's all the more imperative that one carry one's social capital because it's a liminal space, right? So, you know, getting in front of you in the first class line, or, you know what I mean? Like people have to like announce their social capital precisely because it's neither point A or point B.
Exactly.
It's this indeterminate, And
it's funny how the airlines have gone to such great lengths to ensure these hierarchical structures.
Oh yeah.
You know, so you get this, you stand here, you get on the plane earlier, you have all of this, you know, so you have it and you don't. And a lot of that is economically tied to just how much money you hand over to them. But the funny thing about white mobility is that I think when white people are in these places, it's not like their neighborhood, you know, they've gone to great lengths to create gated communities.
That's right, yeah.
And, you know, places like that they control. And so here suddenly everybody's sort of bumping up against everyone else. So they have to reinstate.
Yes, exactly.
The space, the property lines. And then you get a lot of these aggressions, these moments of aggressions. That some of them seem to be mindless, but they, you know, it's like the id just kind of pushes them forward.
Right, and you're there. You're picking it up. You know, it's sort of fascinating. You know, there's in this book there's a kind of the book has multiple aspects, but there is like a part of the book that's about your anthropology. You want to learn something, right? You want to learn how your interlocutors think, and whether they think about their white privilege, right? So there's that driving the book, but there's also a degree to which you want to teach something about, precisely in those exchanges, about you know, what could be learned in the difficulty of addressing white privilege, what could be learned in the stuttering and stammering to sort of either disavow or try to apply language to, you know, like the man who's, you know, sort of said to you, my son didn't get into Yale because he couldn't play the diversity card. And you begin this work of trying to get him to articulate what exactly were you saying there? And the stammering is the learning, right? Like about a kind of, you know, what sometimes we sort of describe as the unmarked status of whiteness, right? The invisibility of whiteness.
Exactly, but also I think I also feel like I'm the one who's trying to learn. Like
Mhm.
I tried to take the position of a person who doesn't already know.
Mhm.
And I was interested in that position and to see what I could learn from that. So the conversation with the guy about his son going to Yale and the use of the diversity card, that's a conversation that kind of frustrated me because I thought, I know this conversation already.
Mhm.
I don't want to have it again.
Mhm.
I want to have another kind of conversation. But he was on that track, and
Mhm.
there was no, we
Mhm.
either you got off his train or you or you have to go with him.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the thing that I learned in the conversations with those white men about privilege is that the use of the word privilege itself is a problem because it allows them to think that you're talking about economic
Mhm.
privilege. And so I don't do that anymore. I don't use, it.
Mhm.
Macintosh made that term popular, but it really is a red herring. It allows people to sort of go inside the Horatio Alger narratives of I worked hard, I
Yes.
did this, I did
Yeah.
that. And then you're always trying to self-correct back to white mobility. And
Mhm.
so since those conversations, I have learned to stay away from that word privilege and
Yes.
move towards this notion of white mobility. Like, what does it mean for white people just to be able to walk out of their house
Yeah.
and go down the street, go to do what they want to do without anyone saying, do you live here? Do you
Right.
want to hear a funny story?
Yes, please. Yes, I like that. Do you live here? Segue. I want to hear the. I want to hear the story.
Well, it didn't. It was not long ago, but I went to walk my dog one morning, and I think I was on the phone, and so I walked out of my house, and I forgot to turn off the alarm. So the alarm went off, but I was walking the dog, and then when I got back, there were all these police in the yard. So I go up the stairs, I put in the code, I open the door, I go in the house, I turn off the alarm, I come back, and I'm kind of talking to the guy, one of the guys. And then my husband has received a thing on his phone saying, your alarm is off. So he drives home from wherever he is. And after all of that has happened, he comes walking up. And the policeman turned to him and said, she says she lives here. And I thought we were having such a good time. And now you had to go and do that.
Oh wow.
It's like,
Yeah.
don't blame us. She
Yeah.
said
She
she lives
said.
there.
Yeah. Oh man.
Exactly. So that sense
Yeah.
of like who the property belongs to
Yeah.
and what, it's
Yeah.
you're constantly pushing up against
Yeah.
these white fantasies about what reality looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And the flip side of it, if shifting from privilege to mobility is sort of the way in which Black people and people of color walk around, negotiate the world with a kind of meta radar on about, where
Exactly.
can they go?
Right.
Where can you go without being sort of stopped and asked for identification or, I mean,
Did you see that video of the
which,
kid who was playing basketball and then the police drive by and he hides himself? It was going around on social media. Yeah.
no,
I mean, it's that
yeah,
ingrained in
yeah,
people. And can you imagine kids having to grow up like that,
yeah,
where they're worried for their own safety?
yeah, yeah,
And not because of what they're doing, but because of who they are?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What is that?
I'm reading Invisible Man in my course right now, and a lot of my students are actually sharing their own. I mean, in ways that when I taught the book in the past, they would not share their own personal
Mm-hmm.
experiences of being policed. They're sharing it in class, and it's really kind of fascinating to teach that book kind of in 2020. Um, I was gonna say, just, okay, I have not seen this video, um, uh, but that sense of being surveyed and wanting to kind of save himself, the basketball, the kid playing basketball that you described.
Mhm.
I had a moment like that in reading the book. So I'll frame it this way: like, there's a moment where you quote a conversation between Homi Bhabha and Toni Morrison. They're talking about remembering. And it sounds very Morrisonian. I don't know who exactly said it, but it sounds very Morrisonian because the statement is, remembering is never a quiet act of introspection or retrospection. It's a painful remembering, a putting together of the dismembered past to make sense of the trauma of the present. And there's something you write about in this book that's part of my traumatic past, which is at our college, there was a cross burning, I think right before you arrived, before I arrived. But when I arrived, it was this was before Google and search engines. So I didn't really know if it happened, but there was a kind of like rumor mill of like, this thing happened years ago. And it was largely between the kind of Black and brown students. I just want you to talk about that. Like, have you been waiting to write about that? Because that happened to you in college.
Yeah, I hadn't been waiting to write about it.
Yeah.
I hadn't. It just, I think when I was working on this book, I went to give a convocation speech, and so that friend, it was at this guy's institution, and afterwards I went to his house and we were sitting around, and I don't know why or how we got there, but suddenly I said, well, we had a cross burning, and he really had no idea, none, zip. And we looked it up, and we both grabbed our phones, because I'm always thinking I must be wrong. Like I must be misremembering this thing. Let me check. And so I looked it up and he looked it up, and he really was shocked. I could see the shock in his face. So that sort of kick-started the thinking around it. I really hadn't thought about it that much over the years. But once I wrote the essay, we fact checked to see what had happened exactly. And I, as I say in the essay, I thought about all of my friends, and I called the person who I thought might know. I wasn't sure, and it turns out she's the one who discovered it. Yeah. Which is one of those kind of strange and bizarre coincidences. And so then when she said, I wonder if they regret doing that, I thought, this sense that white people are benevolent really is something that white people are invested in. That she couldn't believe that the same behavior might have catapulted them into the future, that they, and we looked up, the college had the police records listed 2 male white students who they thought were persons of interest. And both of them have gone on to be in the justice system. Oh my. Which is scary as, oh my. It's terrifying to think that these guys are now judges. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my. That's how, that's how it works. Yeah. Yeah. Like you describe how your friend, the one who reported the incident, sort of assumed that, like, she framed it as like kind of an innocent, youthful transgression that these guys would not, but yeah, we carry this. And there is some chance that they, went on to law school and then became judges and changed their ways. Yeah. But given the way the justice system seems to be working, right. I wouldn't put money on it. No.
Yeah. They had a change of heart. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing that I really loved in the book was the chapter, a complicit freedom, just because that I started to see it everywhere, right? I'm like,
I know.
no, I mean, including. So please explain what you mean by complicit freedoms. But I'll say, yeah, like I saw a photo just yesterday. Serena Williams has blonde braids now, and I'm like, yeah. So explain what that.
Well, I was trying to, once I was working on this book, I was trying to think, what is there one thing in our culture that points to whiteness in a kind of innocent way? Just one thing. And blue eyes doesn't quite work. It in movies, if somebody has blue eyes, you're like, oh, or if you're reading something, they might describe the character as blue, and you're like, okay, I understand what that's supposed to signal. But I thought, blondness is the one thing that people who don't, some people are blonde, but most people aren't. And yet everybody is. In terms of, I saw this picture yesterday of the entire Trump family from the debates, and all of them blonde. Oh, wow. But partially, like you could still see that they were not naturally blonde. And so I thought, oh, like asking the white men about white male privilege, I thought, why don't I just ask men and women about why they dye their hair blonde? And across the races. And I was surprised at how unexamined the decision was. And yet when you asked more and more questions, people began to shut down. So I would approach a woman and I would say, can I ask you why you dyed your hair blonde? And at first they were like, oh, I love dyeing my hair. I just dye my hair. And then I would say, do you dye it other colors? No, I just dye it blonde. So then I said, well, it's not just dyeing your hair, it's dyeing your hair blonde that you're committed to. And then they'd be like, well, people treat me better. And, men are nicer to me, women are nicer to me. And then that story begins to unfold. But then the more they said, the more self-conscious they became, because the math started to, work in their head, and they got on the whiteness, the construction of whiteness train, and didn't want to be on it. I mean, most of the Black women I talked to, they were like, why not? I can do whatever I want. It's my freedom. I can wear my hair blonde today and black tomorrow and red the next day. So for them, it seemed like a bit of fun, and less a commitment to a constructed self in the world.
But you asked a hard question about that, which is, are white supremacist ideals ordinary aspirations? So even though, your Black interlocutors might have, and your Asian American interlocutors also say similar things about the sort of like the sense of power that comes in social exchanges when you have blonde hair. There's a hard question, which is, it's a white supremacist ideal that...
I did have one really heartbreaking moment with a Black woman, actually.
Oh, really?
I think about it. Yeah, I was in Soho, and I said, she was in, I remember this now, actually. I asked her why she dyed her hair blonde, and she said it made her look better. It made her skin lighter. And then she said the thing that really broke my heart. She said, even my mother says so.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, oh no,
Yeah. No safe space.
I know. I was like, where's France Fanon? Bring him in. Sit down. Sit down right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard chapter. Uh, let's. I see that we have some questions from our audience. Do you mind if
Oh,
I sort of read them?
sure, sure.
Okay, so the first question, this is it. Is there anything you would have done differently with this book had you still been writing it in the midst of these latest Black Lives Matter protests and the cultural response to these visible instances of police brutality against Black people? Different topics or conversations you might have explored?
Well, I think, as I said, the Amy Cooper
Yeah.
conversation would be in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the book as it stands now, to me, is an examination of a culture whose foundational structure is white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And its intent was to look at how that commitment is in everything from kindergarten to liminal spaces, to hair dye. And so that project still remains the same, whether or not we have protests. You know, I hope that people will vote in a way, you know, I think the last election, a lot of people didn't vote. So I'm hoping that they will come out and vote this time. And I hope that Trump is not elected. I hope Biden and Harris make it into the White House. But that does not change the history of anti-Blackness in this country.
Right.
We had 2 terms of Barack Obama, who was fantastic, and had he been president now under the COVID, we would have leadership. So that would have gone differently. Yeah. This doesn't have to be going in the way that it's going. We have the callous disregard of somebody who refuses to lead half of America. But there might have been more conversations. A conversation might have come up around specific to the protest, but how many times do we have to say that Black people are killed without cause by the police? And I feel like Citizen was dedicated to that. I feel like this book goes into the same situation, but through a different door.
Mm-hmm.
And that door is a door that says, if we don't start dismantling, or at least becoming conscious about the way in which we have complicit freedom, or complicity, or in collusion in the conversation with whiteness, then we will never be able to begin to dismantle it and reform it structurally.
Structurally,
yeah.
Thank you for that. Actually, I feel as if the second question is coming from the other side. So I'll share it with you. It's an interesting question. So someone asks, writes, it's interesting how this book focuses on so many spaces where we're thrown up against strangers, something that doesn't happen so much now that we're all separated in our homes. What do you think about the sort of conversations we can and are having now that we're distanced? Or how can we find our way toward conversation now?
Well, I think we have even more conversations now, because we are in our homes. I mean, the people call me on the phone, I'm on the phone, and I have a kind of availability. They know where I am. And so I find that I'm having I had many conversations about Amy Cooper when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we still can have those conversations. I know that that's unlikely with strangers, and that is different in this moment, but this moment will not be forever. And also, it's a good time for reflection. It's a good time for us to sit back and really think about what this country has turned into. The fact that we're at a moment of constitutional crisis, we're in a moment of and that we're on the brink of a fascist regime, a leader who is considering not leaving. We've heard about that before. And people allowed this to happen, and they allowed it to happen because they were not willing to admit that their white supremacy is alive and well, not just structurally, but also in terms of groups around this country. They're your neighbors, they're your the people you were working with. They're in New Jersey, in Connecticut. They're not just in the South. I mean, one of the things I wanted this book to do is to point out that these people are on page 130. This image is 2018.
Wow, I hadn't even noticed that.
Yeah, Mark Peterson, the photographer, has been going around the country taking these images in places. This one is in Georgia, but they've been in Connecticut, in New Jersey, all over the place. And most of the hate crimes committed in this country in the last year has been from white supremacist groups. So the commitment of this country to white supremacy was really inside the conversation of this book in a deep way. So I feel like that was my commitment, that I came in through that door, and that was the thing that I was committed to unraveling inside these conversations.
Yeah, and it should be noted on this note that for every conversation you have with a stranger in this book, you're having a conversation with a friend, your husband, where like you're having to work it out with someone.
Everybody.
Yeah, with everybody. So being distanced and isolated doesn't make it impossible for us to have these conversations. Here's the next question. What advice do you have? I know there are lots of students in the audience, so yeah. What advice do you have for students writing some of their first poetry? What helped you when you were starting out?
Well, I studied with Louise Gluck at when I was taking my first poetry classes. And she did not mince words, and and that, looking back, was a real gift. So I think having readers for your work who you trust, who you trust will not spare you, will not hide inside civility.
That's right, yeah.
And who are committed to the work above the friendship, in a way, the work first, the friendship later.
That's right.
I think so. You really want to find that reader. You want to find those people who are your people.
Give it to me straight.
Give it to me straight.
Yeah. I feel the same way in terms of having like scholars who are friends who read my work before I publish it. It's just like, I don't want to hear what you think. I want to hear.
I hear what
Yeah,
you,
I want to hear what you really think.
Right.
And this, I think, comes from someone in my current class, because I'm teaching a class on African-American literature and visual art. And we read Citizen in that class. And the question is, can you talk about your use of visual images in Citizen and Just Us?
Well, Citizen, the use of imagery in Citizen was different from the use of imagery in Just Us. In Citizen, it was an attempt to collaborate with visual artists who I felt were doing the work of looking at racism, even in the same but a different way, you know, in ways that allowed the reader to leave the poem and then take up residence in the image, but still be in the world of the aggression, and be able to kind of to move back and forth in a kind of reciprocity of examination, metabolizing, travel in terms of whatever associative process were put in place. In Just Us, the images were meant to open out the essays in ways that sometimes elaborated on a point, sometimes confirmed something, sometimes troubled the water of an assertion, or sometimes just brought up another image that what was in the essay could remind you of. Sometimes it was just, you know, images of the sky while you were in that plane, portraits. So it had more of an, in Just Us, the images function more archivally, like that Miles Davis photograph. You know, I always loved that photo because of the way he is, the two men in that photo. You have the policeman, but then you have two Black men. You have Miles Davis and the person who's standing in front of him. And the way his head is, that kind of, there's a kind of care in his posture. And the defiance of Miles Davis, that, you know, the way he has the blood on his shirt and jacket, and his hands on his hips, you know, that kind of, this, you see this is what this world has wrought. So that's sort of the archival nature of the reality. Like you can find the reality in the photos as well as in the conversations and texts.
Oh, can I ask a follow-up then about the photo? Is that photo of Marilyn Monroe?
Yes.
It is Marilyn Monroe. Okay, because without blonde hair, it's like, I could barely, okay. So that answers it for the world, that is the photo of Marilyn Monroe. Okay.
That's before this was one of her early jobs before they took her and made her into Marilyn Monroe.
I see.
Norma Jean, yeah.
Here's a question from someone who's teaching your work. I'm a high school English teacher teaching Citizen as a core text in US literature. What advice would you give to teachers about how you'd envision your text being approached in such a course?
Well, that's an odd question, because in the sense that I hadn't envisioned the text in such a course. You know, but now that it is in such a course, I think that Citizen is a book that takes the unsaid and turns it into an object, that allows people to walk into it and decide if they own it in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever done this? Have you ever received
the object of it? Yeah.
Yeah, the subject of it. And so I think it's that was the intent. But you know, the way I would teach it would have to do with maybe formal issues around the use of pronouns and what they give, what kind of openness they provide for the text. How do you consider Black pain in a book like that? Like, what are you supposed to do with that? So I haven't taught it in a core class, so I don't know. I don't teach my own work, so
yeah. I would imagine that would be a little bit awkward. You should leave it to the rest of us.
Today we will be teaching. I will be teaching all of my books.
That would be a little bit odd. Yeah, it's interesting because I was thinking while reading Just Us that you know, I sort of early on said, you know, there's one note in the book which is all about you're wanting to learn something, but then there's another note of you wanting to teach something which has to do with kind of the unmarked nature of whiteness, so the difficulty of just talking about it, but also sort of the consequences that flow from that, right? Like you say, when you use the phrase white privilege, like, you know, people take it as a personal affront, or you know, there are other moments in the book where the response to like the unmarked nature of whiteness is just the kind of denial, right? Like Baldwin would call it like American innocence. Like, I'm innocent of this history that you keep throwing in my face. And I thought to myself that like, if there's like a theme in a lot of like 20th century, 21st century Black literature, it's all about teaching ambivalence, right? Like, you know, again, you know, Baldwin writing about his ambivalent feelings toward his father is his way of grappling with an ambivalent history. You know, Ellison writing about the slave woman in his dream who loves and hates her former master because, you know, he was her former master, but he also gave her sons, right? It's always about sort of teaching how to kind of hold like ambivalence, because our history is an ambivalent history. It's a history that's, you know, sort of freedom went to slavery, right? Like that, needing to grapple with that, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates describing reparations as like a full acceptance of our collective biography.
Exactly.
You know, so I definitely sort of felt that was kind of part of Just Us. I think we're coming close to the end, so I just wanted to sort of thank you, Claudia, for joining us. But more importantly, I just want to thank you for giving us your work. It's a huge gift to us, gift to thought. So I really appreciate your coming and joining us to talk about your recent book, Just Us.
Well, I appreciate your close reading.
Yeah. Thanks, Claudia.